Caleb Morgan had lived on the open prairie for years, and he believed he had seen almost every kind of sight the land could offer. He had seen storms that rolled across the sky like giant dark blankets. He had seen herds of wild horses running through golden grass. He had seen sunsets so bright they painted the entire world in orange fire. But nothing prepared him for the strange sound he heard that late afternoon. He was riding back from a long supply trip, his horse tired and dusty, when he heard something that did not belong on the empty land. It was soft at first, almost carried away by the wind. But it came again, a small cry, a whimper. Then another tiny sound, like someone trying not to sob. Caleb slowed his horse and listened carefully. The prairie was large and open, with no houses for miles. The sound should not be here. Yet it was. He turned toward a dry creek bed, a place where water flowed only in the wettest seasons. The ground was cracked and pale, and a few stubborn bushes grew along the edges. The sound came again, a mix of fear and exhaustion. Caleb's heart tightened. That was no animal. That was a child. He dismounted and guided his horse forward by hand. His boots crunched on the dirt as he walked carefully, not wanting to scare whoever was there. Then, just past a scraggly bush and a fallen log, he saw them. Two young native girls sat close together, both dusty, tired, and frightened. The older one, maybe 12 years old, held her little sister, who looked no more than 6. The younger girl's cheeks were streaked with dried tears, and she held onto her sister's dress tightly. Their hair was tangled, and their feet were scratched and bruised from walking barefoot over the rough ground. Caleb froze for a moment. Not out of fear, but out of surprise. It was rare to see children alone out here. The prairie could be cruel to anyone, especially little ones. The older girl saw him first. Her body went tense, and she pulled her sister behind her, trying to shield her even though she was shaking. Her eyes watched him closely, full of worry and mistrust. Caleb raised both hands gently, palms showing, letting them see he meant no harm. "It's all right," he said, in a calm voice. "I won't hurt you. I promise." The older sister did not speak, but she did not run either. Caleb stepped forward slowly and knelt down so he was not towering over them. He could see how tired they both were. He could see hunger too, and fear from spending who knew how long alone on the land. He reached into his saddlebag and took out his water flask. He opened the cap and placed it in front of them, then moved back to give them space. The older girl hesitated, unsure if it was safe, but the younger sister's thirst won over her fear. She reached out with small, trembling hands, and her sister helped her take the flask. They drank carefully, not wasting a drop. "Good," Caleb murmured softly, relieved they trusted him even a little. He pointed toward his horse and then toward the open prairie. He used simple gestures to show that he wanted to take them somewhere safe. The older girl looked around, as if hoping someone from her family would appear. But the land stayed empty, silent. Finally, she nodded once. Caleb breathed out slowly. He walked to his horse, lifted the small girl gently, and placed her on the saddle. She was light as a feather. The older sister climbed up by herself, still watching him with guarded eyes. Caleb held the bridle and began leading the horse toward his cabin. The walk back took over an hour. The sun dropped lower, turning the sky into a soft pink haze. The wind grew cooler, brushing against the children's faces. Caleb kept glancing back to make sure they were all right. The younger girl leaned against her sister and slowly drifted into sleep. The older one fought her tiredness, her head bobbing forward until she finally gave in too. When Caleb reached his cabin, he helped them down gently. He opened the door and stepped aside so they could enter first. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a table, a stove, and a few shelves, but it was warm, safe, and clean. The girls looked around with wide, uncertain eyes. Caleb lit a lantern filling the room with a soft golden glow. He spoke gently again, showing them the bed and pointing toward the quilts. They hesitated, unsure if they were allowed. So he took a blanket, placed it on the floor for himself, and pointed at the bed, telling them through gestures that it was for them. The older girl finally guided her sister to the bed. They sat there quietly, still cautious, but no longer shaking with fear. Caleb set a pot on the stove and cooked simple soup with vegetables and small pieces of meat. The warm smell filled the cabin. The tired children lifted their heads as their stomachs growled. He poured the soup into wooden bowls and placed them on the table. He stepped back again to show he would not force anything. Slowly, the older girl approached, took a bowl, and brought it back to the bed. She shared it with her sister, feeding her with careful hands. Caleb smiled quietly. He did not ask questions. He understood they were scared and needed rest more than anything else. When they finished eating, the younger girl's eyes closed almost immediately. She curled under the blanket like a small kitten, safe for the first time that day. The older girl stayed awake a little longer. She looked at Caleb, studying his face, trying to judge his intentions. He simply sat by the stove, fixing a loose strap on his saddlebag and pretending not to notice her watching. He wanted her to feel safe enough to sleep. Eventually, her shoulders relaxed. She lay down next to her sister and pulled the blanket over both of them. Within minutes, she too drifted into deep sleep. Caleb sat quietly for a long time, listening to the calm breathing of the children. Outside, the wind whispered across the grass. The cabin creaked softly as the temperature dropped. He kept the fire alive through the night, making sure the room stayed warm. He did not know their story yet, who they were, how they got lost, or how far from home they might be. But he knew one thing with certainty: children should never be alone on the prairie. He checked on them again before lying down on the floor. The younger girl hugged her sister in her sleep. The older one had a peaceful expression at last, no fear left in her face. Caleb felt a strange warmth in his chest, a sense of responsibility he had not expected to feel today. He had delivered supplies earlier that morning, thinking the day would be simple. But now it had turned into something much bigger. As he closed his eyes, he whispered to himself. He did not know that the next day would bring something even more surprising, something that would change the quiet path of his life forever. But for now, he listened to the soft breathing of the two lost sisters and promised himself silently that he would protect them until someone came for them. The sun rose slowly over the prairie, turning the sky from deep purple to soft gold. Caleb Morgan stepped outside his cabin and stretched his arms, letting the cool morning air fill his lungs. It had been a long night, and he had barely slept. Every time the fire crackled or the wind rattled the window, he checked to see if the two young native sisters were still sleeping peacefully in his bed. He knew they were safe, but he wanted to be sure nothing disturbed them. He walked to the water barrel and splashed cold water on his face to wake himself fully. The prairie was calm, almost too calm. Usually, there were birds singing or horses grazing, but the land felt strangely quiet, as if it was holding its breath. Caleb knew that meant something was wrong. Perhaps the girl's family was searching for them. Perhaps they were nearby but still out of sight. When he went back inside, he found the older sister sitting up, watching the window with alert eyes. The younger one still slept, curled under the blanket like a small pup. The older girl did not speak, but she dipped her head slightly at him in what looked like a morning greeting. Caleb gave her a gentle nod in return. He warmed water on the stove and made tea. He placed 2 cups on the table and backed away, letting her choose if she wanted any. She stepped down from the bed quietly and approached the table, picking up 1 cup. She smelled it first, then took a careful sip. The warmth seemed to relax her shoulders, and for a moment, Caleb saw her as she truly was, a child carrying too much worry for her age. As they drank tea, He tried to communicate with her using simple gestures and slow words. He pointed at himself and said, "Caleb." Then he pointed at her, waiting patiently. The girl hesitated, then touched her chest lightly. "Awinita," she said softly. It meant fawn in her language, though Caleb didn't know that yet. He pointed to the sleeping girl. "Her name?" he asked slowly. Awinita smiled gently, the first smile he had seen on her face. "Suni," she whispered. The name suited the little one perfectly. Now that they had exchanged names, the air in the cabin felt warmer, more familiar. Caleb understood names were important. It meant trust was growing, even if only a little. After finishing his tea, he tried to ask how they ended up so far from home. He pointed at the door, then to the open prairie. He made walking motions with his fingers. Awinita watched him closely, then knelt on the floor and traced a rough shape in the dust mountains. Trees. A small symbol for a camp. She pointed far in the distance, then pointed at herself and Suni. Then she drew swirling lines, showing wind or a storm. Caleb understood. They had wandered too far while searching for something in the hills. A sudden storm must have blown through, and the changing winds confused them. They lost their direction and kept walking until they ended up alone on the prairie. He nodded thoughtfully and pointed toward the horizon. "Your family?" he asked gently. "Will they come?" Awinita nodded. She pressed her hand over her heart in a clear gesture. Yes, they would come. Caleb felt a slow wave of relief. He didn't know much about their tribe, but he knew enough to understand that families were close and protective. If the grandmother or parents were searching, they would not give up until the girls were found. Still, he expected to see riders, scouts, or at least someone walking across the land by now. But the prairie remained empty. To distract the girls from worry, Caleb cooked breakfast, simple eggs, and soft bread. The smell woke Suni, who blinked sleepily before sitting up. Awinita lifted her into her arms and gently brushed her hair with her fingers. Suni rubbed her eyes and saw Caleb, and her face lit up in a small smile. She remembered the warm food and soft bed from last night. She climbed down from the bed and toddled toward the table. Caleb placed a plate in front of her, and she began eating with small bites. Awinita joined her after a moment. The cabin filled with quiet sounds, spoons tapping against bowls, soft chewing, the crackle of the fire. Caleb sat nearby, repairing a piece of rope and pretending not to watch the girls too closely. He didn't want them to feel pressured, but he couldn't help feeling protective. After breakfast, he stepped outside and checked the land again. He saw hoofprints, but old ones. Wind had already begun to erase them. There was no sign of anyone approaching. His horse grazed near the fence, lifting its head only when Caleb returned. Inside, Awinita was standing near the window, looking out at the wide world with worried eyes. Suni clung to her dress, sensing her sister's fear. Caleb walked toward them slowly and pointed toward the open prairie. "We stay," he said gently. "Your family will find you." He hoped his voice carried confidence that she could trust. Awinita looked uncertain, but she finally nodded. To help pass the time, Caleb took out a small wooden horse he had carved months ago. He offered it to Suni. Her face brightened instantly, and she grabbed the toy, running little circles around the room. Awinita allowed her sister to play but kept her gaze on Caleb with gratitude mixed with caution. They spent the day inside and outside the cabin. Caleb showed them how he fed his horse, how he fixed the fence, and how he chopped firewood. Awinita watched everything carefully, her eyes wide with curiosity. Suni helped gather small sticks, dropping them proudly into a basket. It was strange for Caleb to have company after so long living alone. The laughter of children filled the quiet spaces he had grown used to. Their presence made the cabin feel more alive. Later in the afternoon, Awinita sat near the fire, gently weaving dried grasses into small shapes. She worked with quick, experienced fingers. Suni napped on a blanket nearby. Caleb sat at his table, sharpening one of his tools, when Awanita spoke for the first time in a full sentence. "Grandmother strong," she said in slow English. "She find us." Caleb looked at her and nodded respectfully. "I believe she will." Awanita placed her hand over her chest again, showing the importance of her words. "She come soon." The certainty in her voice comforted him. If the grandmother was as strong and determined as Awanita described, it was only a matter of time before she arrived. Evening crept across the land, washing the prairie in soft purple shadows. Caleb lit the lantern again, and the warm glow filled the cabin. He cooked another meal, and the girls ate with calm confidence now, no longer tense or frightened. But even with food and warmth, Awanita kept glancing toward the door. She was waiting for a sound, a sign, anything that meant her grandmother was here. Caleb stayed awake with her long after Suni fell asleep. He sat by the window, listening. The night was quiet again, broken only by distant coyotes calling to each other. Awanita sat beside her sister, alert even when her eyes grew heavy. Caleb finally said softly, "You can sleep. I'm here." He pointed to himself, then to the door. "I watch." Awanita hesitated, studying his face one last time. Something in his calm expression must have reassured her. She nodded slightly, lay beside Suni, and pulled the blanket over them. Caleb sat by the fire again, adding wood now and then, keeping the cabin warm. He wondered about the grandmother, who she was, how far she had traveled, and what she would think when she found her granddaughters safe in a stranger's cabin. He didn't know that the next morning would bring exactly that. He didn't know that the sound of footsteps he kept hoping to hear would finally come. And he didn't know how much that moment would change everything that followed. But as dawn approached, he made himself a promise. He would not let fear, danger, or cold get near those children again. Not while they were under his roof. Not while he could help them. The prairie slept outside. But Caleb stayed awake, waiting for the first sign of approaching family. Waiting for the moment the girls would be returned to the arms of someone who loved them. He didn't know how close that moment already was. The morning arrived slowly, as if the sun itself was tired from the long night. Caleb had barely slept, resting only in short moments with his back against the wall. The fire in the stove had burned low, glowing like quiet embers. Outside, the prairie was still wrapped in a pale blue light. It was the kind of silence that made a person listen carefully, expecting something to happen. Caleb stood up, stretched his stiff shoulders, and looked toward the bed. Awanita and Suni were still sleeping peacefully. Suni's small hand rested on her sister's arm, and Awanita's hair fell softly across her face. For the first time since he found them, they looked completely at ease. Caleb felt relieved. They had survived fear, exhaustion, hunger, and cold, and now, at least, they had one night of true safety. He stepped outside, letting the wooden door creak behind him. The air was cold and crisp. A small patch of frost covered the grass, sparkling under the early sunlight. Caleb walked a few steps from the cabin and scanned the distance. He expected to see a rider or a small group coming toward him, but as far as his eyes could reach, there was nothing but open land. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "Where are they?" he muttered to himself. If the grandmother was strong and determined, she should be close by now. Maybe she was following different tracks. Maybe she had found a clue Caleb didn't see. Maybe she had been moving all night and was simply approaching from another direction. Caleb knew one thing for sure. Someone was searching. He finished checking the land and went back inside. As soon as he closed the door, the sound made Awanita sit up quickly. She blinked, confused for a moment, then remembered where she was. Suni woke up right after her, rubbing her face sleepily. Both girls watched Caleb expectantly. He smiled gently. "Good morning," he said, even though he knew they couldn't understand every word, but they understood his tone. And that was enough. He heated water again, made tea, and cooked a simple breakfast. The cabin filled with the smell of warm bread and soup. Juanita ate quietly but kept glancing at the door every few minutes. She was waiting for something, someone, Caleb noticed. And he felt the same tension. He knew that moment was coming soon. After breakfast, the girls played on the floor with the wooden horse Caleb had given Suni. They made soft sounds, little giggles, and whispers in their language. The sound filled the cabin with life. Caleb found himself smiling just listening to them. He stepped outside again, letting them enjoy a peaceful moment inside. The sun had risen higher now, bright enough to make the frost melt slowly. Birds had started to move again. The land seemed more awake, more alive. And then he heard it. A soft shuffle. A faint step. Something on the ground that did not match the sounds of birds or wind. Caleb turned quickly toward the direction of the noise. He expected to see a rider on horseback, or maybe a group of 2 or 3 tribal members. But instead, he saw a single figure walking slowly toward him. An old native woman. She moved steadily, though her steps were small and careful. She had long gray hair braided into 2 heavy plaits that touched her chest. A warm shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were sharp and full of emotion, fear, hope, exhaustion, and something deeper. At her side hung a small woven pouch. Her hands were rough, strong, and weathered from years of work. She looked like someone who carried the weight of her entire family on her shoulders. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The grandmother. She approached the cabin slowly but with determination. As she came closer, Caleb saw the anxiety on her face. She was looking for someone. 2 someones, and she would not stop until she found them. Caleb raised his hand politely in greeting. She did not respond right away. She simply looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to judge his heart in one glance. Then she spoke in her language words Caleb could not understand, but her tone was filled with urgency. Caleb nodded toward the cabin and gently gestured for her to follow. She hesitated, tense, uncertain. Her eyes narrowed slightly, ready to defend her family at any sign of danger. Caleb understood. He stepped aside, letting her pass him easily. He wanted her to see the girls before anything else. The grandmother reached the door and placed her hand on it. She paused, closing her eyes for a moment as if gathering her strength. Then, she pushed the door open. Inside, Juanita froze. Her eyes widened. She stood so quickly the wooden horse dropped from her hand and rolled across the floor. Suni blinked up at her sister, confused, then turned toward the door. The grandmother stepped inside. For a moment, no one moved. No sound filled the cabin except the soft crackling of the fire. Then, Suni let out a small, high cry of joy. She ran toward the grandmother with her hands outstretched. Juanita followed, slower at first but then faster when she saw tears appearing in the old woman's eyes. The grandmother knelt down and wrapped both girls in her arms. She held them tightly, whispering their names over and over, her voice shaking with relief. Tears ran down her wrinkled cheeks, but her embrace was strong. Caleb looked away out of respect. The moment was theirs, a reunion that needed no words. After a long time, the grandmother stood up while keeping a hand on each girl's shoulder. She turned to Caleb slowly. Her expression was filled with gratitude, pride, and deep respect. She placed one hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. It was a silent thank you, one that carried more emotion than anything she could say in English. She tried to speak, searching for the right words. "You. Help," she said slowly. "You. Good man." Caleb shook his head gently. "I just did what anyone should." But the grandmother's eyes told him that, in her experience, kindness toward her family was rare and precious. She walked around the cabin, examining everything. She saw the blankets he had given the girls, the warm bed they slept in. The wooden horse Suni was still clutching. She saw the empty bowls from breakfast, and the fire still burning strong. Everything showed care, protection, and respect. The grandmother turned back to Caleb. She spoke again in her own language, long sentences he couldn't understand. But her voice was clear, strong, grateful. She held his hand with both of hers, squeezing it in a way that made her message unmistakable. "Thank you for saving my granddaughters." Owinita translated a few words softly, pointing at Caleb, then at her grandmother's heart. He understood enough. After the girls rested, the grandmother prepared to take them back home. She wrapped Suni in her shawl and held Awinita's hand tightly. Before leaving, she turned to Caleb again and pointed at him firmly. "Tomorrow," she said, "I come." Caleb blinked, surprised. "Tomorrow?" he repeated. The grandmother nodded. "I come." Her message wasn't clear, but the feeling behind it was. She wanted to return. She had something important to tell him, something she wasn't ready to say now. With a final nod, she led the girls out of the cabin. Caleb walked with them a few steps, watching as the grandmother guided the sisters across the prairie. The wind played with their hair as they moved farther and farther away. At one point, Suni turned back and waved her tiny hand at him. Awinita smiled, shyly. Then they disappeared into the wide land. Caleb remained standing outside his cabin long after they were gone. The prairie felt different now, lighter, warmer, filled with a strange sense of connection he couldn't explain. He had met people before, helped others when needed, but nothing had ever felt like this. Nothing had reached him so deeply. He didn't know what the grandmother planned to tell him tomorrow, but he knew one thing. When she knocked on his door again, he would be ready to listen. The morning after the grandmother left with Awinita and Suni arrived with a quiet beauty. The prairie was covered in a thin layer of silver mist, making the world look soft and dreamlike. Caleb stepped outside his cabin and breathed the cool air deeply. His cabin felt strangely empty without the two sisters. He had grown used to their soft voices, their small footsteps, and the gentle warmth their presence brought. He looked out into the distance, remembering the grandmother's final words. "Tomorrow, I come." The memory echoed in his mind. What did she want to say? Why did she insist on coming back alone? Caleb wasn't sure. But he knew it mattered deeply to her. He spent the morning tidying the cabin. Not because it was messy, but because he needed something to do to pass the time. He folded the blankets neatly, cleaned the bowls they had used, swept the floor, and set fresh water on the table. Every small task reminded him of the girls. He could almost see Suni playing with the wooden toy horse on the floor, or Awinita watching him with those intelligent, observant eyes. By midday, the sun had risen high and warm. Caleb stepped outside again, shading his eyes as he looked across the horizon. The prairie stretched out endlessly, golden grass moving in soft waves. He scanned the land carefully, searching for movement. He half expected the grandmother to appear exactly as she had the day before, walking slowly, quietly, and alone. But nothing moved in the distance. Caleb sighed and went back to repairing the fence near the corral. He hammered a loose board into place, his mind wandering. He wondered about the girls' home. What kind of place was it? Did they have siblings? Did they live in a small camp or a larger village? He tried to imagine their grandmother strong, wise, and protective, teaching them stories, songs, and traditions. As the afternoon sun lowered slightly, Caleb paused his work and wiped sweat from his forehead. He turned toward the cabin to fetch water, and that was when he heard it again. A soft knock. Not loud, not rushed, just the same steady knock he had heard yesterday morning when the grandmother arrived. Caleb's heart tightened. He set down the hammer and walked toward the door. His steps grew slower, as he reached the wooden frame. With one steady breath, he opened the door. The grandmother stood there. But this time, she wasn't alone in spirit. Her entire presence felt different. Yesterday, she was full of urgency and worry. Today, she carried calm strength, as if a great weight had been lifted from her heart. She wore the same shawl, but it looked cleaner, freshly shaken out. Her braids hung neatly over her shoulders. She held a small, woven basket in her hands, and her eyes, though still lined with age, carried a gentle warmth. Caleb stepped aside respectfully. "Come in," he said softly. She nodded and walked inside. The room felt smaller with her presence, not because she took up space, but because of the importance she carried with her. She placed the basket on the table carefully and looked around the cabin, as if remembering the moments her granddaughters spent here. After a quiet moment, she touched her chest and began speaking in her own language. Her voice was low, calm, and full of gratitude. Although Caleb couldn't understand the words, he understood the meaning behind them. She was thanking him again, thanking him more deeply this time, now that the fear and panic of losing the girls had faded. She paused and tried speaking in simple English. "You gave them safety," she said slowly. "You gave them warmth, food, kindness." Caleb shook his head. They were just children. Anyone would have done the same. But the grandmother raised her hand gently, stopping him. She took a step forward, her expression firm. "No," she said. "Not everyone." She tapped her chest. "My people, many times, not treated with care." She pointed at him next. "You different." Her words humbled Caleb. He looked down at the table, feeling a mixture of emotion, honor, responsibility, and a quiet sense of connection with people he barely knew. The grandmother opened the basket she had brought. Inside were several items: a loaf of handmade bread, dried berries, a small pouch of herbs, and a beautifully carved wooden charm, shaped like a bird with outstretched wings. She lifted the charm and held it out to Caleb. "For you," she said. Caleb hesitated before taking it. The charm was smooth and warm from her hands. It felt like more than a simple gift. It felt like a symbol of thanks, of respect, of trust. He looked at the grandmother. "It's beautiful," he said softly. She nodded, pleased. Then she sat down on the chair near the table and invited Caleb to sit across from her. He did, wondering what she wanted to say next. For a moment, she was silent. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, as if gathering strength. Then she opened them again and began speaking in slow, careful English. "My family," she said, pointing toward the land beyond the cabin, "believe you were guided by good spirit. You find my granddaughters when night was near. You help without wanting anything." She placed her hand over her heart, then extended it slightly toward Caleb. "This makes you friend of us." Caleb felt a warm, unexpected emotion rise inside him. A friendship with her family? He had lived alone for so long. The idea of being welcomed by people with such strong bonds felt almost unreal. The grandmother continued, "Our village, not far. If you come someday, you are welcome. Not as stranger, as friend." She held his gaze firmly. "I ask you to visit. You bring light to the girls' hearts. They speak of you last night." Caleb blinked in surprise. "They did?" "Yes," she said with a small smile. "Suni hold the wooden horse. She say she sleeps safe because of you." Her smile grew softer. "A Winita too. She say you patient, calm, good." Hearing that touched Caleb deeply. He didn't realize how much his small actions meant to the girls. The grandmother lifted the basket again and pushed it gently toward him. "These gifts. Small," she said, "but they show our respect." Caleb felt overwhelmed for a moment. He didn't want to take anything in return for helping children, but he also understood that refusing a gift like this would be disrespectful. So, he accepted it with gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly. She nodded, satisfied. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly. The afternoon sun shone through the window, warming the wooden floor. The grandmother looked around the cabin one last time before standing up. She walked toward the door, then stopped and turned to Caleb. "Come visit soon," she said. "The girls. They wait to see you." Caleb smiled. "I will," he promised. The grandmother gave a final, respectful nod and stepped outside. Caleb followed her to the doorway and watched as she began walking across the prairie. Her steps were slow but steady, carrying the strength of her years. Even from behind, she seemed surrounded by a quiet dignity. As she moved farther away, the golden grass swayed gently around her. Caleb watched until she disappeared into the same vast land from which she had come. When he finally stepped back inside, the cabin no longer felt empty. The girls' laughter was gone, but their presence remained in the woven charm, the basket of gifts, and the memory of their trusting faces. Caleb placed the wooden bird charm above his door, letting it hang where it could catch the sunlight. The light made it glow softly, like a symbol of hope and new connection. He sat down on his chair, feeling a calm warmth in his chest. Life on the prairie could be lonely, quiet, and harsh. But now, something had changed. He had found a bond that crossed distance, culture, and fear, a bond formed from simple kindness. He knew he would visit the village soon. He wanted to, not out of duty, but out of genuine affection for the grandmother and the two girls who had wandered into his life unexpectedly and left it brighter. The prairie outside was wide and endless, but for the first time in a long time, Caleb didn't feel alone in it. He felt connected. He felt part of something bigger, and sometimes that was more than enough.